so much. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I want to just jump right in by saying Martha is a great historian who's been very helpful to me in my work as a journalist and essayist at the New York Times. And I've written a lot about the 19th Amendment. So when the 19th Amendment anniversary, the centennial, shows up, I'm having an out-of-body experience. I'm reading news stories in a lot of papers and listening to broadcast stories that are saying, universally saying, the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. We know that that's not true. We know, in fact, that millions of women had the right to vote before the 19th Amendment, and that millions of women, most notably Black women in the South, but not exclusively them, were denied the right to vote after. But we have this kind of almost a machine that goes of itself, wanting to define the 19th Amendment as the end of the battle for women's rights. But as Martha shows here in Vanguard, the struggle for women's voting rights did not begin with the right suffrage movement. It preceded that. You know, Black women in the 19th century were vying for rights, political rights, and rights in organizations, religious organizations before that. And that struggle went on and on afterwards with people like Fannie Lou Hamer, Septima Clark, SNCC, and the SCLC. So Martha, as your book is out in the world now, you've been working on it for a while, what can we say about the persistence of this myth that, you know, erases the struggle of Black women and defines the 19th Amendment as the end of the struggle for women's rights? Why is that so persistent?
Well, first of all, thanks so much for being here with me tonight, Brent. It's really an honor, and thanks to the folks at Books Are Magic for hosting us. Mm-hmm. Part of the answer lies in some early activists, women's suffrage activists, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan Anthony, who even in the midst of their movement, begin to write its history. And over the course of almost 40 years, they produce nearly 6,000 pages, 6 volumes, The History of Women's Suffrage, which, though it might appear on the shelf to be exhaustive, turns out to be a highly selective telling of the story. And historians, frankly, are, if you will, a bit duped by these volumes, which is to say some of the earliest histories of women's votes are written out of these volumes that highlight the activism of some women and set to the side or mute the activism of others, and define the movement as having been bracketed by a small but interesting meeting of women and some men in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, and then culminating in 1920 with ratification of the 19th Amendment. So there are layers to the telling of history always, and part of our work, my work, alongside that of many other historians of the last generations, has been to, if you will, peel back the layers on those histories, particularly when they veered in the direction of myth. But, you know, myth has that ability to gain a kind of traction in the American imagination. It's much harder to implant the old historian's view. It's more complicated than that, but it is more complicated than that.
I mean, I was reading this when I was writing the Times editorial, Centennial editorial, and the book is so rich for many reasons. I mean, you show, in fact, that Black women in the AME church, you know, in the early 19th century, were vying for preaching licenses in the church, and were vying for rights in the colored conventions and so on. And that this struggle is coming to fruition by the time the meeting of Seneca Falls takes place. So literally speaking, you open up this history and show how Black women perceived the Seneca Falls movement, and they continue after. But also, what I was pleasantly surprised to see is that you are animated by restoring the place of Black women, not just as a historian, but because of your family. Because you have, great grandmother and extended family that worked hard in the struggle for universal rights. And I think that is the kind of thing that really enriches this book. Tell us about how you felt emotionally about bringing that into your history.
Well, the first emotion I felt was a bit of embarrassment, because as I was finishing Vanguard, I work in an office where my grandmother, my great-grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, their portraits hang. They're right here. You can't see them, but I can. And I'm always accountable to them in my work in some way. That's why they hang there. Mm-hmm. And yet it occurred to me that I didn't know their stories, that I really had no idea what they had been doing in 1920, what degree they were engaged with the question of women's votes. Did they vote? I had a lot of questions, and I took a kind of detour. Don't tell my editor, you can tell him now, but you couldn't tell him back then that I took a detour as I was finishing the book to learn what I could about them. And that turns out to feel very urgent, right? How did I feel? I felt very...
It comes through in the writing.
Yeah.
It really does.
Yeah. It's urgent because, one of the things that I know as an African-American women's historian, is that our field, our work does not grow out of, seminar rooms, styled after German, German academia in the 19th century. Our work grows out of real Black women's struggles, out of their writing, out of their activism, out of their ideas. And so I needed to know a little bit more about mine. There were some disappointments. I went, for example, to the North Carolina State Archives, where my grandmother, the state where my grandmother had lived in the 1920s, thinking, okay, now I'm going to find those registers. Now I'm going to find those voting records. I'm going to know, did she vote? Well, it turns out nobody preserved those records. They're gone. And so I was pretty discouraged, and then I get lucky. A good historian leans a little bit on luck from time to time. And in this case, my grandmother had given an interview in 1978, looking back at her long life. And when she does, she talks about voting rights, but she doesn't talk about 1920 at all. She talks about the 1950s and 60s, because she's living in Greensboro, North Carolina. She's part of a community at Bennett College for women there, young Black women. Her students are out in the neighborhoods in Greensboro, knocking on doors, registering local folks to vote, getting them to the polls. And as she puts it, it was thrilling. And that was a lesson to me in precisely what we were talking about, which is that if I had ended my history in 1920 with the 19th Amendment, I would have missed my grandmother's chapter, because her chapter, right, the one she wanted to tell us about, the one she left to us in her interview, was one about the 50s and 60s and how Black women's voting rights are earned in those struggles rather than in the struggles for the 19th Amendment. And that is a takeaway, right, from Vanguard, that when we center our histories on Black women, we have to listen for them to tell us how to write them, when they start, when they end. And my grandmother had always taught me a lot in her lifetime, but even in the writing of this book, she's still there teaching me.
That comes through. Also, I was impressed as a I tell people I'm not a historian. I just play one in the newspaper. but one thing you kept saying throughout the book is that these women in the 19th century left for us words. They wrote pamphlets, they wrote speeches, they wrote in newspapers, they wrote letters, and they talked about their struggle, you know, and the fact that that was, you know, so overlooked, that was available in the original white history of the suffrage movement. That was completely available there, but it was not, it was not utilized and not illuminated. And so your version of the suffrage / voting rights movement, you know, begins with someone like Gerina Lee, who was, you know, began to preach, the first woman allowed to preach in the AME church. Could you tell us her story?
Absolutely. Gerina Lee is born at the end of the American Revolution in New Jersey. She spends her young life as an indentured servant and eventually migrates to Philadelphia. She is called by God to preach, as she tells it. And that calling is so strong that despite the norms, despite the strictures in her religious community, which is the AME church, despite that, she will defy convention, give in to her enthusiasm, and eventually persuade Richard Allen, who is destined to be the first bishop in the AME church, persuade Allen to make an exception for her. And that's important because Lee, as you said, is among these women who leaves us her story in a memoir she publishes in 1836. She recounts this spiritual journey, but she also recounts for us the ways in which what in 21st century parlance we would call sexism, right, plagues her. Bishop Allen relents only after a long, long series of reflections. And she goes out on the road. She's an itinerant preacher in the classic Methodist style. She's winning converts to the church. But she recounts how at every turn, right, she is rebuffed, she is refused, she's denigrated.
Pulpits are closed to her in many places.
Pulpits are closed, despite Bishop Allen's authorization. And ultimately, she is at the core of what becomes a movement within the AME church for church women's rights. Women want preaching licenses. They will want to hold office. They will want to control the money that they raise. And by the end of the century, they are going to be looking to be ordained to the ministry, to be fully equal to their male counterparts in this and other Black Methodist denominations. And so, but the reason I follow Gerina Lee is that in addition to her story and her activism, she's a thinker. And I want to know where the ideas that are so perhaps commonsensical to us today about why no racism, why no sexism in American politics, why those should be outside of the political qualification, outside of political culture. The answer is because women like Gerina Lee thought hard about that, wrote it down, preached it, and began to develop among Black women a political philosophy that they alone, frankly, champion for a very long time. This view that there's nothing legitimate about racism, there's nothing legitimate about sexism when it comes to power and politics, in the church, yes, but in anti-slavery politics, colored conventions, and more.
One of the things that comes up is, I just want to dilate for a second on how she finally wins a preaching license. In this episode where she goes to church and spontaneously stands up from the pews and begins to preach.
Well, you know, it's important to say, you know, because as she says, the minister, the speaker, the preacher has faltered, right? So he loses his place, and she stands up and takes the floor. And Bishop Allen is converted, if you will. He
Sure.
said her calling is as genuine as any man in this sanctuary.
Yes, and so she does that. So she, as you say, she begins this movement in the AME Church, and what I was brought into this through your book, how this ferment is starting, and how these women in the Black church, they go at it systematically. They keep making their case to the denomination conference. They keep going, and they're not allowed to speak. Eventually they get a man to speak for them. Mm-hmm. And so they build these alliances, they build these relationships, and they make this campaign that goes on that finally, by 1848, bring fruition in terms of preaching licenses. And later in that same year, when the suffragists meet in Seneca Falls, one of their demands is that women have rights in church, when in fact, Black women have already won those rights.
Well, and this is important because one of the things we know about the Seneca Falls meeting is that there are no Black women present. There are no Black women on the record. And for a long time, your question earlier, how do we get to this misunderstanding about this history? For a long time, their absence was interpreted as indifference. People said, Black women didn't show up because they weren't interested in women's politics. They weren't interested in women's rights. Well, it turns out all we had to do was follow them, if you will, out of Seneca Falls to Philadelphia, to the General Conference of the AME Church that spring. And there they are, with a petition, with male allies, not only making a demand in the formal proceedings of the church, but then winning that demand. Right. And then their demand is echoed in Seneca Falls later that summer in July. So Black and white women are oftentimes thinking about the same questions, but where they organize, where they intervene differs.
And as I said to you in an email sometime back when I was writing this editorial, I mean, in sum, what happens is the erasure of Black women from women's histories has to do with the fact that these Black women were waging their fight on the Black side of the color line. Yeah. They were waging it in the political conferences. They were waging it in the Black denominations. And they were, as you say, so movingly you say here, that the Black women were the nation's first anti-racists.
Anti-racist feminists, I think.
First anti-racist feminists. Yeah. And they were waging these battles in these organizations. And it's so lovely and moving to see you bringing those forward. And another thing you say, and I've heard you say before, is that these women were in fact, a lot of them intellectuals. I mean, they were in fact had very, systematic thought about feminism, very systematic thought about anti-racism, and systematic thought about universal rights. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so they were in fact, and it's my favorite speech, of course, we jump a little bit forward in 1866, where Frances Ellen Watkins Harper meets at the big women's conference in New York. And she stands up and she gives a litany of complaints about how Black women are treated in public, thrown off of streetcars, Harriet Tubman being beaten up on trains. And she says, listen, she sounds the first notes of what they call now intersectionality, right? She says to the white woman in the audience, you white woman, you speak of rights, I speak of wrongs. We're being beaten, we're being thrown out. And in fact, if you really want to claim to have a rights movement, your rights movement has to include our grievances, which have manifold and have been demonstrated publicly. So that's where, and also, Harper sort of gets allotted too. in the end. And
Absolutely.
Mhm.
You know, Harper, you know, I wanted to write about that moment because it is written about a great deal. And this tension after the Civil War about how this radical coalition of women's rights activists and abolitionists are going to work together, especially on the question of voting rights, is often visited. It's often visited to, on the one hand, malign Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who calls for educated suffrage, which is code for white women's suffrage on the one hand, or some people trot out this meeting to vilify Frederick Douglass, who says, he endorses the view that this is the Negro's hour and that Black men need the vote. It's a matter of life and death, Douglass will say. And what infuriates me, frankly, is that we tell and retell that scene as if there were no Black women present, as if Frances Ellen Watkins Harper wasn't there in 1866, Sojourner Truth in 1869. And not only were they present, but when we listen to them, we discover that they actually have a distinct political philosophy about all this. Watkins Harper's great line, "We're all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity," is an alternative view that says to this coalition, let's not, right?
I would urge our listeners to make a note, and after this is over, to just Google Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's speech in 1866 in the founding of the Equal Rights Organization. And you will find it is extremely, extremely modern.
Yeah,
you know,
it is. My students are stunned by it,
right.
because it sounds very 21st century. Well, the language is a little 19th century, but the ideas feel very 21st.
Right, and it's very forceful. Yeah. And also the current running through your book here, the current, again, is something I discovered partly in your guidance while writing my editorials. Was the extent to which these Black suffragists they were forceful and also arguing for universal rights at the same time. They were saying that when white women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and so on, were basically trying to separate race and gender, and these women were saying, as Frances Harper was saying, we're all bound up together in this. And if you have a movement, the real test of that movement is how it elevates the most aggrieved and deprived among us. Yeah. That is really, that's sort of a Baptist message, and that's definitely a Methodist message, But it also it's very, very forceful, and that these women get cut out of the history until relatively recently. Now, what was the moment that brought them back in? That made them accessible to people like me, who's not a historian, who's a journalist?
Sure. So we owe a tremendous debt to the late Dr. Rosalind Terborg Penn, who as far back as the 1970s is working on a doctoral dissertation, reading critically those 6 volumes, The History of Women's Suffrage, suspecting there is more to the story than that. She goes in and begins to unearth the unacknowledged, the unmarked roles that Black women play within the movement for women's votes. By the time I'm in graduate school, her book is published now, and it's the very first book I read about the history of women's suffrage. I don't read the old Stanton and Anthony story first, fortunately for me. So she really sets us on a new path, and she teaches us many things, including not only that there are Black women present within that volume and unacknowledged, but there are dozens others who don't make it into that volume. And I think most importantly, she instills in folks like me a kind of doggedness about the archive, which is that when Black women aren't there, keep looking, right? Keep looking until you find them. And that's really a critical dimension of Dr. Terborg Penn's legacy. Her doggedness in the archives is is something we inherit, and I hope is reflected in Vanguard. But it is a turning point, no doubt. And it is not her view and her critique of that stock history is not easily accepted or easily received or incorporated. And so our work is to continue to amplify those insights.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was fortunate enough to get to know her a little bit in the year before she died. It was an extremely moving experience, and certainly illuminated my view of what had happened in history. So we do that, Dr. Torborg Penn brings us back. She illuminates 120 or so Black suffragists who were not in the record, and we see their contributions. And one of the things we see about them, we get a sense of why they were not included. And 2 points you bring up in Vanguard, one is that their struggles are on the Black side of the color line. In Brooklyn, in Manhattan, in Baltimore, in Nashville, in Chicago, Fannie Barrier Williams, Mary Church Terrell, in DC. We see them out there laboring, and so part of it, they were out because they were left out because they were working on the Black side of the color line. The other thing was they kept insisting that, in fact, you could not separate sort of race from gender.
Yeah. So here, by the time we get sort of to the end of the 19th century, we're on the road, if you will, to what becomes the 19th Amendment. And Black women do not sign on in important numbers to the major suffrage association that emerges in 1890, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Why? Because that organization defines not only its politics, but its goals in terms that set the problem of racism to the side. The women, Black women, are going to organize in what becomes the National Association of Colored Women. Why? Yes, because many of them want to work on the struggle for women's votes, but they also are as deeply committed to a campaign that would secure anti-lynching legislation. For Black women, those two things are intertwined. Think about it. If you win a federal amendment that affirms women's voting rights, and it is still possible for terrorists, white supremacists, to intimidate you, or worse, to keep you from the polls, you don't enjoy a voting right at all. And Black women watch that scenario unfold in the lives of Black men, and they are sure that they cannot work through a politics that would set aside lynching, that would set aside Jim Crow, segregation, and the like. And so it is impossible, in a sense, to reconcile those two political visions. And if I could just add, and for white suffragists, increasingly, it is deemed expeditious to keep Black women to the side in an effort to win the support of Southern women and Southern lawmakers for their ultimate goal, which is a federal amendment. So there are many things keeping Black women at the periphery of this suffrage movement, but it doesn't mean they're out of the game. It doesn't mean that they're not engaged. They are deeply committed suffragists, in fact, as we learned in 1920, when they struggle to use the 19th Amendment, even as so many of them fail.
Well, the people are still working, historians are still working. I heard from Paula Giddings not so long ago on this issue of how the white suffragists compromised with white supremacy to advance the possibility of the 19th Amendment. And I've had people say to me, well, they had to do what they had to do. And my answer to that is, as an African-American person, a descendant of enslaved people, that, our peonage and our suffering was always expeditious for someone.
Mm.
Always expeditious for someone. And so really that later on. Parenthetically, there were white women who didn't take this view. There was people like Lucy Stone, who has also been elided from the history. So I think we're in a great coming together now of a missing history that is getting much more rich, much richer, and much more complex. And the great and as you bring forward in Vanguard, oftentimes when I was listening to these radio programs and reading these news stories about the great victory that women won in 1920, the great victory that women won. And then, I look to my own family and to your own family, and I see in my family and others from Virginia that people like Fannie Lou Hamer, Septima Clark, were still risking their lives to win the vote almost a half century later. So so I really haven't come to a reasonable explanation in my mind of how people in 2020, 100 years later, can still form their mouths to say that this guaranteed women the right to vote. And in many ways, they're repeating the same kind of racist error as Stanton and Anthony, implemented in the 19th century when they defined women as white. Mm-hmm. I still, so that sense, the definition of women as white, it still kind of pervades the discourse, don't you think?
I do. I'm seeing.
Oh, is it question time? Great. Okay, let me find some questions. I'm sorry, fans. Let me just. And I click the Q&A button. Okay. Georgia Silver Siemens, how do we get people to be thoughtful about the term women when they are only referring to white women? Good question.
Well, thank you, Georgia, and welcome to my world, right? that part of this work, right, is to expose, is to reveal, is to surface, right? That frequently when we say, for example, women won the vote in 1920, what we mean is largely white women won the vote in 1920. And so my approach to getting at your question and the problem you point up is to write a book. It's to teach and to teach alternative histories and to hold all of us to a more exacting kind of language. But I think the other reason or the other way to get at it, of course, is to appreciate that part of what we're looking for in 2020 is a history that's useful to all of us and that acknowledges all of us in an extraordinarily complex and roiling history of the United States. And that means that in this story, even of the story of women in the vote, we have to slow down to ask about African-American women, Latinx women, Asian women, Native women, and more, that we are all part of the national body politic here in 2020. And it's okay to demand that our histories reflect the kinds of things we think we need to know about how we got here.
One more, Taisa Way. Forgive me if I mispronounce your name. The church is clearly critical for Black women. What about the women's club movement, of which I believe Black women were also engaged in leading?
Sure. So the National Association of Colored Women is founded in the mid-1890s. It is if you will, a companion to the national women's suffrage associations of the same era. By the eve of World War I, the NACW has upwards of 300,000 members, women, Black women across the country, organized in clubs, now knitted together by this national association that has a suffrage department that will have leaders who are very much linked and visible to and visible in the suffrage movement. But as I said earlier, the importance of the NACW is that when we look at its agenda, we appreciate the ways in which it never is reduced to a single issue or a single question. Yes, vote, yes, anti-lynching, yes, equality in education, in healthcare, and more. The NACW has a much broader set of issues that it pursues, essentially, because for Black women, these are not perceived to be questions that can be pulled apart from one another.
Right. And just a little dilation on that. One of my favorites in my new research has become Fannie Berrier-Williams in Chicago, who basically becomes a real champion. And she goes to white organizations of white women, and she says, you know, I am for voting rights, right? But I'm also for you getting your necks off your feet off the necks of these Black women who are trying to get office work, who are trying to become business stenographers, who are trying to work in hospitals, and that you are the main people keeping them out. And so she actually, even though she interacts, she actually speaks at Stanton's memorial, but even though she interacts with those women, she brings them the charge, listen, you are complicit in racism. You keep talking about rights, but you are also complicit in racism. And I got another question here. Naomi Tarantal, please tell us something about your research process. Did you have to travel to many places to search through the archives? How difficult was it to find primary source material?
Well, thanks for that question, Naomi. I love that question. I started this project as a 19th century historian. And so I was, I thought, very familiar with the 19th century materials that are undergird the story of Vanguard. But my editor, and then my grandmother, kind of echoing him, said, you can't leave this story in the 19th century. You can't even leave it in 1920. So I don't know, I blundered into the 20th century and discovered why my colleagues work there so much of the time, because the archives really explode along with it. You know, that African-American women's materials for a very long time in this country's history are not valued, they are not preserved, they are not part of major archival collections, with some important exceptions like Howard University's Moreland Spingarn collection, and to an important degree the Library of Congress. But by the time we get to the 20th century, Black women understand clearly their place in history, the preservation of their materials. There are institutions now, African-American-led institutions, that are going to preserve those materials. And it is delicious. I say it is delicious. And so the hardest part about writing the 20th century part of this book was how selective I had to be, because it was not possible to include every woman who was affiliated and associated and part of this vanguard. And even the ones who were here, I'm only able to tell partially. But I hope for those of you who have an interest that, you know, the footnotes, I know people cringe when you say that, but the footnotes are there in part to leave a trail for people who want to read more.
Absolutely.
So I hope that I left a trail that will help folks do the kind of further reading, the further investigation, looking at the primary materials for yourselves, and discovering a great deal more about the women who are in Vanguard and the many who are their fellow travelers across 200.
It is amazing what one finds in footnotes, I got to tell you.
Yeah, it is.
Often in a different direction. So Georgia has a follow-up question. I'm going to get to you all, no problem. How are you thinking about the current president's appeals to, quote, the suburban housewife, end quote, in relationship to the role of white women in racist projects, for example, anti-busing, anti-desegregation of schools?
Yeah, well, certainly the president's rhetoric hopes that the kind of tensions, the kind of rifts, the place of racism in white women's politics has not expired, even here in 2020. He is trading on the view that white women still will do the expeditious thing, will do the pragmatic thing, will vote by way of their own narrowly defined interests. I can't say whether he is correct or not correct. We will learn the answer to that come November. But for anyone who has studied this history of women's votes, the kind of rhetoric that he is deploying is tragically familiar. I hope that all Americans see through it, but I'm not sure that they do.
We also have another question here from someone we all should know, Michelle Duster.
Oh my gosh.
You know, of the great lineage. What tie do you see between the racial dynamics of the suffrage movement and the Me Too movement and more current women's marches?
Well, I first want to say a special thank you to Michelle Duster for joining us. Michelle Duster is a author, teacher, activist, and is also the great-granddaughter of the unparalleled Ida B. Wells, and has a book coming out this February about Ida B. Wells. And we're looking
great.
Michelle, there is an important connection between Tarana Burke's Me Too movement and the story I tell in Vanguard. And it is this, that Black activist women going back to the early decades of the 19th century tell us again and again and again about the role, the regrettable role that sexual violence and the threat of sexual violence plays in their lives. When Frances Ellen Watkins Harper decries how she is regarded on streetcars and on railroads, part of what she is alluding to is the way in which Black women are targeted, yes, with denigration, but also with the threat of sexual violence when they travel, when they attempt to sit in ladies' cars, and more. So I think of Tarana Burke as, of course, standing on her own as an extraordinary 21st century leader, but she leads on a question in a tradition that for Black women goes back to the beginning of the 19th century. It is one of those questions that Harper tries to get on the agenda for Stanton and Anthony. She doesn't succeed. That is the sort of question that Stanton and Anthony cannot hear. It is in part because Stanton and Anthony are the sorts of women who are witness to this sort of denigration that is leveled at Black women. But Tarana Burke's cause rings mightily in the pages of Vanguard. She continues that struggle.
Mm-hmm. And let me just ask one last question of our author here. To what extent, Dr. Jones, does the schism that opened up in the post-Civil War women's movement, you know, Frances Harper goes her way, the other Black women go their way. Many times they try to keep a relationship with the mainstream white women, but that generally fails. To what extent is that schism evident to us today?
I'll tell you where I see it, and it might not be where you expect.
No, that's fine.
It is precisely around the question of monuments and memorials that are being created here in the 21st century. Mm-hmm. And I am struck by the choice, and it is a choice to reach back for figures like Stanton and Anthony, Alice Paul, Carrie Chapman Catt, women who, whatever their hearts may have felt, traded in anti-Black racism to further their political interests. Why do we reach back for them? as our sheroes in the 21st century, when frankly we could reach back for Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and
Amen.
see a woman whose vision is our ideal today. Why don't we reach back for Sojourner Truth, who calls for a kind of women's rights that was intended to touch all sorts of women and not simply elite or privileged women? Why do we continue to reach back for those figures? I don't really have an answer, but when I see the ways in which we practice memorializing women's activists from our early history, I see us, if you will, promoting and extending not only their accomplishments, but also, frankly, their sins. And why we reach for them, I don't know, but we do.
Yeah. You know, there, just to leave this off, because I can go on all night, we could talk all night about this, but there is a memorial coming online in Memphis that has Ida B. Wells, right? That has Mary Church Terrell, that has at least 3-4 Black women in a big omnibus memorial, that has a man, a white man, who cast a deciding vote on the Tennessee floor to ratify the 19th Amendment, that has a fuller picture. And I keep looking to that one and saying, that is more the model of where we need to go to end this process of elision and erasure.